What's up, night owls? Welcome back to Demon Sleep. Real quick, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. I personally read every single one of them, and honestly, it makes my day seeing you all from around the world. If these dark tailies help you drift off or just escape reality for a bit, smash that like button and subscribe. But only if you think we've earned it. No pressure. Alright, lights off, rain on, blankets up. Let's dive into tonight's nightmare fuel. Story 1. My confession lit the match. In a year and a half, the stretch of asphalt called Route 23 had swallowed nearly 200 drivers. 43 of them never knew what really happened. Dale did. He kept his secret riding with him every night, a small plastic pouch tucked inside a magnetic box beneath the patrol car's seat. Not much, just enough white grit to ruin a life. Enough to turn a traffic stop into a felony. The powder wasn't hard to come by. It had drifted into his hands after a dealer died alone in a county cell, cold before anyone bothered to count what he'd been holding. Once a man was gone, his evidence became fog. Dale figured the dead didn't need forms filled out on their behalf. Nobody ever asked questions. Nobody ever wanted to know. And in Dale's mind, that made him ordinary. He told himself plenty of others were doing the same thing across the hills and river towns of southeastern Ohio. The only difference was finesse. Dale was selective, careful. He didn't bother with rusted sedans or locals scraping by. He waited for outsiders, license plates from far away, polished vehicles that whispered money. Drivers with pressed shirts, clean hands and fear in their eyes. People who couldn't afford to miss work, couldn't risk a courtroom, couldn't stomach 6 months of uncertainty in a county where prosecutors and deputies shared tea times and beers. Most of them never fought back. They paid instead. Cash slid across dashboards, rings removed quietly, watches unclasped with trembling fingers. Dale called it a lesson fee, a price charged for speeding through the wrong county, for ignoring brake lights, for advertising wealth where it didn't belong. If they were smarter, they'd have taken another route. If they were cautious, they'd have checked their tail lights. If they weren't so loud with their comfort, he wouldn't have noticed them at all. He'd been rehearsing that logic for 3 years. Some mornings, it still sounded convincing. That night the car announced itself before he even checked the speed. Champagne paint catching the moonlight. A luxury sedan fresh enough to still smell like a showroom. Dealer paper clung to the rear window. Pennsylvania plates. And there it was, the passenger side brake light dark when it shouldn't have been. He clocked the speed twice. 47 in a 45. Clean enough to ignore. The light was. That was all he needed. Dale flipped on the cruiser's flashers as the road dipped past a long-closed ice cream stand, its windows boarded like blind eyes. The sedan reacted instantly. Too instantly. No slow signal. No searching for a turnout. The driver slammed the brakes and stopped right there on the narrow shoulder, as if he'd been bracing for this moment. That alone made Dale smile. He called the stop in over the radio. Routine words, calm voice, paper trail intact. Then he stepped out, one hand hovering near his holster, the other steady on the door. As he approached, his mind clicked through the ritual he knew by heart. Watch the mirrors, scan the cabin, track the hands, look for sudden movement. Look for anything at all that could justify what was about to happen. That kind of behavior could mean 2 things. A man ready to bolt, or a man with something dangerous within reach. Dale hadn't decided which yet. The window slid down before he even reached the door. Eager, or rehearsed. Cooperation and suspicion often wore the same face. The driver was young, mid-20s. Maybe pale skin, blue button-down with the sleeves pushed neatly to the elbows. His hands were planted on the wheel at perfect symmetry, like a diagram pulled straight from a driver's manual. 10 and 2. Textbook. 2 textbook. His face looked oddly preserved, smooth and tense, as if blinking were optional and he'd chosen not to. His eyes were worse, unfocused, glossy, drifting somewhere far beyond the dashboard. Dale had seen that stare before. Pills did that. Or shock, or something heavier happening behind the eyes. The cabin smelled expensive at first, leather conditioner, clean and sharp, but beneath it lingered another scent. Damp earth, the smell of soil after rain, the kind that clung to cars abandoned too long in impound lots. It didn't belong here, not in a vehicle this pristine, still wearing its dealer paperwork like a price tag. License and registration, Dale said. The man reached for the glove compartment with slow precision, each movement deliberate, controlled, almost ceremonial. He passed the documents over without lifting his gaze. His fingers were long, bloodless, immaculately groomed. No jewelry on the right hand. The left wrist, though, that caught Dale's attention. A heavy steel watch, subtle to the untrained eye, loud to someone who knew value. The license read, Michael Faraday, Columbus address, 26 years old. The photo could have been taken 5 minutes ago, same vacant stare, same tight mouth. Dale studied the card, then the man, waiting for the usual tells. The nervous swallow, the forced smile, the twitch. Nothing. Faraday returned his hands to the wheel, posture unchanged, eyes fixed forward as if he were listening to something only he could hear. Dale asked him to step out of the car. Faraday obeyed instantly. The pat-down turned up a thin wallet with 3 crisp $100 bills, and the watch, a Rolex Submariner, heavy and unmistakable once you'd handled enough of them. The thing on his wrist cost more than Dale had earned in half a year. Stand by the back, Dale said. Faraday moved to the rear bumper and stopped, hands folded behind him, feet planted, eyes locked on the far end of the road, unmoving, calm in a way that didn't feel natural. As Dale walked back toward the cruiser, he kept Faraday in the corner of his vision. Most people betrayed themselves without realizing it, shifting weight, scanning for exits, flexing their hands. Faraday did none of that. He might as well have been carved out of stone, breathing slow, steady, controlled, like someone practicing stillness. Dale pulled out his ticket book and began writing, slow and deliberate. Plate number, vehicle identification, make, model. He dragged the moment out, letting the silence stretch, letting the tension settle into the air. Something about this stop felt off, and not in the way Dale usually enjoyed. Silence was usually his sharpest tool. The longer he let it stretch, the tighter it wound people up. Fear softened them. Fear made deals easier. That was the rule. But when Dale finally looked up, the man at the back of the car hadn't shifted an inch. Faraday hadn't glanced around, hadn't checked the road, hadn't even looked back at Dale. He stood there loose and unbothered, like time was something other people worried about. That calm scraped at Dale's nerves. It was the wrong flavor of composure. People stopped on the roadside came in 2 types, defiant or defeated, loud or small. No one just waited. And no one looked at a cop the way Faraday had during the pat-down. Not with fear, not with hate, but with quiet curiosity, like Dale was a specimen pinned to a board. Dale shoved the thought aside and did what he always did. He opened the driver's door and leaned into the car. The interior was spotless. Paperwork in the glove compartment, insurance, registration, a tire gauge, a pack of mint gum, all ordinary, too ordinary. He checked beneath the seats. Dust. A stray receipt from a coffee shop 2 cities over, dated days earlier. The back seat held nothing but a small gym bag stuffed with neatly folded clothes, still smelling of detergent. Nothing wrong, nothing illegal. That part came next. Dale slipped his hand beneath the cruiser's seat, retrieved the small plastic bag, and walked back to the sedan. He placed it carefully into the door pocket, positioned just right, obvious enough that only a fool would claim ignorance, invisible enough to pass a glance test. He closed the door and returned to Faraday. "Anything illegal in the vehicle?" Dale asked, already shaping the answer in his head. "No," Faraday replied. His voice was calm, flat, like a line delivered exactly as rehearsed. "I found a controlled substance," Dale said. He watched closely, waiting for the collapse, the widening eyes, the stammered denial, the panic. That moment always came. Except this time it didn't. Faraday's lips twitched at one corner, the barest suggestion of amusement. And then, for a heartbeat, something sharp lit behind his eyes. Not fear, not anger, recognition. As if he'd just seen confirmation of something he already knew. Then it vanished. Dale moved fast after that. Cuffs snapped shut behind Faraday's back, metal biting into skin. He guided him into the rear of the cruiser. The air inside was thick with old sickness and artificial sweetness from the air freshener swinging above. Faraday leaned back against the seat, head tipped slightly upward, eyes half closed. He didn't struggle, didn't test the cuffs, didn't look around. He waited. Dale pulled onto the highway and headed south, away from town, the road stretching empty ahead of them. He kept the radio off. No conversation, no explanations. Let the quiet do its work. That was how negotiations began in the dark space between certainty and dread. There was a turnoff ahead, near an abandoned stretch of land where the earth had been carved open and forgotten. Dale aimed the cruiser toward it, unaware that this time, the silence wasn't working the way it always had. Out there, the signal bars vanished one by one until the phone might as well have been a brick. The woods pressed in tight, branches knitting together overhead. The road swallowed so completely you couldn't spot it from a short walk away. Dale liked that. He'd used this stretch more than 10 times. It was quiet without feeling hidden, close enough to feel ordinary, empty enough to stay private. He didn't even think about the drive anymore. His hands knew the turns. His body followed muscle memory. This was the easy part. He'd stop the car, let them step out, lay it all out in plain language. 2 doors, one open, one closed. Hand over the valuables, money, jewelry, anything worth lifting, and he'd escort them to the county line with a warning about being smarter next time. Or refuse and take the long way through holding cells and impound lots. 72 hours waiting to see a judge. A charge that stuck. A future chewed up by legal fees and favors owed. No one ever chose the second door. Dale glanced at the mirror. Faraday sat exactly as before, back against the seat, head tilted up, breath slow, steady. Like a man resting on a train, not someone locked in the back of a police cruiser with his life tipping sideways. Dale had seen every reaction imaginable in that seat. Tears, bargaining, rage. One man had shaken so hard he couldn't finish a sentence. Another had soaked himself trying to swear innocence. Fear always found a way out. But not this time. The quiet started to crawl under Dale's skin. Most people filled silence with noise, excuses, promises, small talk, anything to remind you they were human. Faraday offered nothing. He hadn't spoken since the cuffs went on, just waited, as if Dale were the one taking too long. They were a few miles from the turnoff when Faraday finally spoke. 41 Hickory Lane, he said softly, casual, like pointing out a landmark. The house with the blue shutters, big tank in the backyard. Dale's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. He told himself it meant nothing, a lucky guess. A sign glimpsed through trees, something overheard. He kept his eyes forward. Your wife's name is Linda, Faraday continued, voice level, unhurried. She drives a light-colored sedan, same shade as mine. Gets her hair done on Depot Street every other Thursday. Leaves the house around 9:30, back before 11. Dale's foot eased off the accelerator. The cruiser slowed without him meaning to. He checked the mirror again. Faraday hadn't moved. His eyes were still fixed upward, expression empty, like he was reading from a list written on the ceiling. Your daughter's Emma, Faraday said. 16. Takes the bus from the corner of Hickory and Pearson at 7:15. Walks home most days, Tuesdays and Fridays especially. That's when Linda works late at the hospital. The road curved ahead. Dale's pulse hammered in his ears as he guided the cruiser toward the shoulder, the trees closing in, the silence finally breaking not from fear, but from something far worse. The cruiser lurched as Dale yanked the wheel and slammed onto the shoulder. Gravel exploded beneath the tires, pinging the undercarriage like shrapnel. He threw the car into park and twisted around in his seat. For the first time, Faraday looked at him. There was nothing there. No anger, no satisfaction. Just a dull, depthless stare, like still water that reflected nothing back. Dale didn't remember deciding to draw his weapon. One second it was holstered, the next it was in his hands, aimed through the steel cage at Faraday's chest. His finger hovered tight on the trigger, safety disengaged. Somewhere, a distant, rational part of his mind screamed that this was insanity. A cuffed man, inside his own cruiser, camera rolling, radio live. But that part of him was drowned out by panic. Faraday had just mapped his life with surgical precision. His home, his wife's routine, his daughter's walk to school. Dale's hand shook so hard the barrel clattered softly against the cage. Faraday didn't react, didn't raise his voice. He tilted his head slightly, studying Dale with mild curiosity, like a biologist examining an unfamiliar insect. You didn't stop me, Faraday said calmly. I stopped you. The words hit Dale like a punch to the chest. I've been behind you for 3 weeks, Faraday continued. Every shift, every night, waiting for you to flip your lights. Dale's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His throat felt packed with sand. He swallowed, tried again, and managed a sound that barely passed for a question. What do you want? Faraday smiled, a thin, careful curve that never reached his eyes. I'm federal, he said. Task Force Corruption Unit. Dale's vision narrowed, the edges dimming. The gun was still trained on Faraday, but his hand had gone numb. He couldn't feel the grip anymore. You've been under observation since late summer, Faraday went on, voice even, almost bored. We have video of you planting evidence during 4 separate traffic stops, audio from your phone, financial records that don't line up with your paycheck. 3 drivers have already agreed to testify. They're protected. The words stacked up, heavy and unreal. Surveillance, recordings, witnesses. They sounded like noises, not language, like something overheard in a movie playing in the next room. Faraday kept going. He explained he'd worked the case quietly without clearance, told his supervisors he was out on medical leave, used the time to follow Dale to document patterns to build something airtight. He said everything was already secured, files, footage, timelines, stored safely, duplicated. The car you searched, Faraday said, nodding faintly. It holds all of it. Dale's pulse thundered in his ears. Faraday's tone never shifted. No threat, no gloating, just facts laid out cleanly, one after another. I wanted to talk first, he said. Before paperwork, before arrests, I'm offering you a choice. Dale's finger twitched on the trigger. Faraday leaned back slightly, relaxed despite the gun, despite the cuffs. If you're smart, he said quietly, you'll take the deal. Leniency, Faraday said. A lighter sentence. A softer place to serve it. 10 years instead of a lifetime. He said Dale had until they crossed the county line to decide. The gun sank slowly. Dale's arm felt like it belonged to someone else. His hand shook so violently he almost fumbled the weapon before shoving it back into the holster. He turned forward and stared through the windshield, breathing hard, eyes fixed on the ribbon of empty road. The clock on the dashboard glowed, 3:47 p.m. Emma would be spilling out of school in 13 minutes, backpack slung over one shoulder, same corner, same routine. Linda would be at home, folding clothes or watching afternoon television, living in a version of the world where none of this existed yet. 10 years, Dale thought, minimum security. He'd be old when he walked free, but he'd still walk. Linda would leave him. Emma would pretend he never existed, but there would still be air, sunlight, mornings. And then another thought crept in, colder and sharper. Faraday was alone. No partner, no trailing units, no marked cars waiting just over the line. He said the evidence was in the sedan, not logged, not filed, not sealed away behind concrete walls and key cards, just data in a vehicle that could vanish overnight. One agent, one body, one forgotten pit carved into the earth decades ago, a place nobody bothered to check anymore. Dale's mind started adding things up it shouldn't have been able to consider so quickly. Risk against certainty. A gamble against a sentence already written. Confession versus erasure. The smart choice was to cooperate. The safe choice was to surrender. But Dale hadn't survived 3 years by choosing safe. He'd built something that worked, perfected it, outpaced everyone who should have caught him long ago. And some stubborn, rotten part of him refused to believe it ended here, not by a quiet man with a blank stare and a borrowed badge. Then there was the thing he couldn't ignore. Faraday hadn't just threatened prison. He'd mapped Dale's life, his home, his wife, his child. He'd spoken their routines aloud, calmly, deliberately. That wasn't leverage, that was intent. A reminder that Dale's family existed inside the blast radius of this moment. That thought sealed it. Dale's hands were still trembling when he turned the key and eased back onto the road. He drove south for another mile. Then he signaled and turned off, away from the highway, onto a narrow track leading toward the abandoned mine. In the mirror, Faraday watched him, calm, unmoving, not surprised. As if this road had always been part of the plan. The access path narrowed into gravel and dirt, branches scraping the sides of the cruiser as the trees leaned in, swallowing them whole. Branches dragged along the cruiser as the road narrowed, a steady scrape that sounded like nails being pulled down steel. The rhythm crawled under Dale's skin. He'd heard it before twice, once with a dealer who sobbed as he handed over the keys to his truck, once with a terrified college kid who offered up his refund check like a peace offering. Both times the exchange had been clean, quiet, forgotten. This wasn't like that. The forest closed in as they descended, oak and hickory stripped bare for winter, their limbs lacing together overhead like the ribs of a cathedral. The air dropped fast, colder by the second, settling into the hollow like a held breath. When Dale exhaled, a faint cloud bloomed in front of him. He checked the mirror again. Faraday watched him, expression unchanged. No tension, no fear, just that same unreadable calm as if he were observing the scenery. Dale wanted to speak, wanted to demand what Faraday thought he was doing, what end he imagined waiting for him down there. But the words wouldn't come. His throat felt sealed shut. Sweat slicked his palms despite the cold, the wheel damp beneath his grip. The access road ended in a clearing. The mine lay open before them, a scar in the earth left to rot since the 80s. Sheer walls of exposed rock dropped away into a basin filled with rainwater that had darkened over decades into something thick and lightless. The surface didn't ripple. It absorbed the sky without reflection. People told stories about that water. Old machines swallowed whole. Animals that wandered too close. Maybe worse. Dale had never cared to find out which ones were true. He shut off the engine. Silence fell hard. No birds, no breeze, not even the distant hum of the highway. Just the ticking of hot metal cooling and the sound of his own breath, fast and uneven. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a crow called out. The sound bounced off the mine walls and came back wrong, warped, hollow, unfamiliar. Dale's heart slammed against his ribs. His mouth tasted like rust and smoke. This is simple, he told himself. One shot, quick, clean. The body disappears into the water. The car vanishes into pieces by morning. Metal crushed, evidence erased. Just another rumor layered onto old ones. No body, no case. He sat there, staring at the black water, convincing himself that this was no different from any other choice he'd made, unaware that the quiet wasn't empty at all, and that something had already shifted beyond his control. No body, no proof, no case. Faraday would turn into a story, another agent who pushed too far and vanished. It happened. Dale knew it did. Still, his hands wouldn't steady. He'd hurt people before, suspects who fought back. His wife, when arguments crossed a line he pretended didn't exist. A boy in high school who'd laughed at him. Those moments lived in gray space. This was different. This was final. Once the trigger broke, there was no explanation big enough to contain it. He would become something else entirely. A man who executed someone in cold blood. A man who deserved whatever followed. His eyes dropped to the weapon on his hip. The retention strap was already undone. He couldn't remember doing it. His fingers drifted to the grip. Cold metal bit into his palm, grounding and terrifying all at once. Dale stepped out of the cruiser. His legs wobbled beneath him. The cold air hit his face hard enough to sting his eyes. He circled to the rear door and pulled it open. Faraday looked up. Still calm, still unreadable, as if this were unfolding exactly as expected. "Get out," Dale said. Faraday complied, awkward with his hands pinned behind him. Dale clamped a hand around his arm and marched him toward the edge. The ground gave way beneath their boots, soft with rain. Each step made a wet sucking sound. Faraday's polished shoes darkened quickly, red clay caking the leather. At the edge, Dale raised the gun again. He pressed it to the back of Faraday's head, right where bone met spine. A shot placed for efficiency. No struggle, no noise, just a switch flipped off. "I'm sorry," Dale said. He meant it in some crooked way. He'd never crossed this line before. Beatings could be rationalized. This couldn't. Faraday didn't answer, didn't plead, didn't turn. He stood there, head bowed slightly like a man at prayer. Dale tightened his finger. Just a little more pressure. Then Faraday laughed. Not a nervous sound, not disbelief. A full, shaking laugh that bent him forward, shoulders bouncing, wild and loud in the dead air. The sound crawled over Dale's skin, wrong in every possible way. Dale stepped back, gun still trained on him. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he rasped. Faraday straightened slowly and turned. Dale should have fired right then. But the emptiness in Faraday's face was gone. In its place burned something bright, electric joy. "I lied," Faraday said. "I'm not federal." Dale's finger locked. "I'm the one who cleans up men like you." The words barely had time to land before Faraday smiled wider and opened his mouth. A razor blade flashed on his tongue. So thin Dale hadn't seen it before. Faraday nudged it free, spat it neatly into his palm behind his back. At the same time, his other hand slipped a tiny key from a seam in his belt. Clicking. One cuff opened. Clicking. Then the other. Dale's mind screamed to catch up. He fired. The shot detonated across the clearing, birds exploding from the trees. But Faraday was already moving, twisting aside with inhuman speed. The bullet tore through empty air. Faraday closed the distance in 2 steps. Steel-kissed flesh. The blade sliced across Dale's wrist, shallow, surgical, severing the tendons that held his grip together. The gun fell from his hand, thudding into the mud. Dale swung with his left, catching Faraday hard in the jaw. Teeth cracked. Faraday stumbled, went down. Dale dove for the gun, fingers clawing through wet leaves and clay. He grabbed it, slick with mud, lifted. A boot smashed into his temple. White, then gray, then red. He hit the ground hard, ears screaming like a bell had gone off inside his skull. The gun was gone again. His right hand refused to obey him. Blood streamed down his wrist, soaking into the earth as Faraday stood over him, breathing steady, smiling like the hunt had finally begun. Blood soaked through his sleeve and dripped into the dirt, dark and steady. The wound was worse than he'd realized. Beneath the red, something pale showed through, tendon or bone, he couldn't tell. His vision tilted and swam. He blinked hard, trying to stay present. Faraday stood over him, chest rising and falling, mud streaked across his face. He held Dale's gun now, turning it slowly, studying it with detached interest. Blood leaked from his split lip, but he ignored it. After a moment, he removed the magazine, worked the slide, and calmly tossed both pieces into the mine. They vanished without a sound. Dale tried to rise. He made it halfway up before a boot slammed into his ribs. The air tore from his lungs in a wet gasp. Something gave way inside his chest. A sickening crack followed by white-hot pain that spread outward in brutal waves. He collapsed again, curling instinctively, fighting for breath. Every inhale felt like shards grinding together. His mouth filled with blood. He spat, watched it stain the clay. Faraday crouched beside him. The razor blade still gleamed in his left hand. With the other, he reached into Dale's belt and pulled free the spare cuffs. Easy, familiar, like muscle memory. "Here, what happens now?" Faraday said softly. "You confess. Everything, every stop, every lie, every dollar. You say it into your radio so it's recorded. And then I leave." Dale tried to answer. Blood bubbled at his lips. He managed one word. "Why?" Faraday didn't hesitate. "Because you earned it. Because you wore a badge to hide your rot. And because if the system won't hold you still, someone has to." He hauled Dale upright by the collar and dragged him back toward the cruiser. Dale's boots carved crooked lines in the mud. His ribs screamed with every jolt. He tried to resist, but his legs were useless, numb, trailing behind him like they weren't his anymore. Faraday shoved him against the driver's door and snapped a cuff around his injured wrist, chaining it to the steering wheel. The metal bit into torn flesh. Fresh blood spilled down his hand and pooled in his lap. Dale made a sound that wasn't quite a scream, raw and animal. The trunk opened, something sloshed. Faraday returned with a red fuel can. The smell hit first, sharp and burning, clawing at Dale's eyes. Faraday twisted the cap and poured. Cold liquid drenched Dale's legs, soaked the seat, his belt, the floor. It seeped through fabric and into skin, making him shiver uncontrollably. Dale thrashed. The cuff chewed deeper into his wrist. Whatever Faraday had cut gave way further. His hand went dead below the wound. He couldn't feel his fingers, couldn't move them. Faraday kept pouring over the dash, the console, the radio. Fuel ran in clear streams down the windshield and pooled in every hollow. The air was thick enough to taste. Dale gagged. When the can was empty, Faraday tossed it aside and pulled a small book of matches from his pocket. He held it up, letting Dale see it clearly. "Confess," he said. "You've got about 2 minutes." Dale's left hand fumbled for the radio. His fingers shook so violently he missed the button twice. When he finally keyed it, his voice barely sounded human. "This is Sheriff Hickman," he croaked, giving his badge number. Static answered. Then a young voice asked his location. He told her where he was. He told her to record everything. And then he broke. He talked until his throat burned. He named the dead man whose drugs he'd stolen. He described the traffic stops, the planted evidence, the cash, the watches, the threats. He listed victims, locations, dates, accounts. He confessed to things he'd buried so deep he'd almost believed they weren't real. Faraday stood nearby, listening, the matchbook loose in his fingers. When Dale finished, he sagged against the seat, empty. The radio crackled with stunned silence. Faraday closed the matchbook and slipped it back into his pocket. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. Then he walked away, leaving Dale cuffed, soaked, broken, alive long enough to understand that some reckonings don't come from courts or badges, but from the dark places where no one is watching and nothing can be undone. Dale's voice broke completely, cracking under the weight of confession. Tears ran through the mud and blood on his face, carving rivulets that mingled with the crimson from his split lip. Every word spilled out, every lie, every planted ounce of evidence, every stolen dollar across 3 years of deceit in the county. He spoke until nothing remained inside him but raw, exhausted truth. The radio went silent, leaving only his ragged breathing. Then the dispatcher returned, professional, clipped, telling him to hold tight, that backup was on the way. But Dale knew it wasn't real. Not in time, not fast enough. He looked up at Faraday. The younger man stood perfectly still, the matchbook dangling between his fingers, his face a strange mask of mud and drying blood, cracks forming like crusted paint. His split lip had stopped bleeding, but his presence was unnatural, as if he had risen from the ground itself, something buried and unstoppable. Dale tried to speak, to demand answers, to plead, but his throat was a closed, raw cavity. All that escaped was a wet rasp. Faraday tilted his head, unblinking, considering him. "Good," Faraday said softly. "Now they know." He struck the match. The tiny flame flickered orange in the growing breeze that whispered through the hollow of the mine. 1 second, 2, 3. Each heartbeat stretched. Dale saw his own reflection in Faraday's eyes, small, terrified, handcuffed, soaked in gasoline, helpless. Then Faraday let the match drop. It landed on the driver's seat. Instantly, fire exploded, racing across the upholstery, climbing the steering column and licking Dale's lap. Heat hit him like a physical wall, suffocating, searing. He screamed, thrashing against the handcuffs, but they held. His uniform burned through to his skin, blistering, blackening, the stench of scorched hair and cooking flesh filling the hollow like smoke in a kiln. Faraday stood back, calm, face lit by the inferno, observing with no flicker of emotion. Then, as casually as walking down a sidewalk, he turned and strode toward the access road, hands in pockets, disappearing into the cold winter light. Dale screamed again, each inhale a fiery agony. The radio crackled, still alive, the dispatcher shouting over the static, demanding confirmation, trying to pierce the nightmare. But Dale could barely breathe, barely focus, fire consuming him, the gasoline hissing, the metal biting into his wrists, and every second stretching into eternity as the flames climbed higher, relentless. The dispatcher's voice cracked through the radio, frantic, calling for anyone to respond to the strip mine. Units were 5 minutes out, 3, 1. The fire had already reached the cruiser's gas tank. In a heartbeat, the explosion ripped through the clearing, igniting everything around it. The cruiser lifted, twisted, glass spraying in every direction. Flames shot 20 feet into the sky, black smoke curling into the cold November air like a dark monument. When the sheriff's deputies finally arrived, 4 minutes later, the blaze had reduced the cruiser to a smoldering skeleton. Twisted metal sagged into itself, heat waves shimmering off the scorched asphalt. What remained of Dale Hickman was still handcuffed to the steering wheel, charred beyond recognition, his badge the only fragment of identity left on his blackened chest. Search teams combed the surrounding woods for hours, but the man Dale had spoken to, the one who orchestrated everything, was gone. No footprints, no tire tracks, no sign that he had ever been there. It was as if he had evaporated into the cold air. 3 days later, the champagne-colored Lexus turned up in a long-term lot at the Columbus airport. Immaculate, wiped clean of any trace, its VIN tied to a Cleveland rental agency. The name on the agreement was Michael Faraday, an address that didn't exist, a credit card reported stolen months earlier. The DEA confirmed, no agent by that name, no investigation in Cade County. The Ohio State Police opened a file on what they called the cop killer, a suspected phantom responsible for the deaths of at least 32 law enforcement officers across 6 states over the past decade. The pattern was always chillingly precise. Corrupt cops, isolated locations, confessions broadcast over radios, bodies burned beyond recognition. Witnesses in 4 separate cases remembered a young man driving luxury sedans, out of state plates, no prints, no DNA, no real identity. He was never caught. Emma Hickman was sent to live with her aunt in Cincinnati. Linda sold their house on Hickory Lane and moved to Florida. Neither spoke publicly about Dale, nor the horrors he had hidden behind his badge. The safe deposit box in Chillicothe was opened under court order. $38,000 in cash, 4 Rolex watches, 2 diamond rings, and a bag of meth with Curtis Phipps's fingerprints still on it. The strip mine was filled with concrete. A chain-link fence went up around the perimeter, warning of environmental hazards and unauthorized entry. The county council voted to rename the Access Road Memorial Way, though no one could agree on what or who it was meant to honor. And on a clear day, if you stand where the cruiser had burned, the sharp scent of gasoline still clings to the dirt, a ghostly reminder of the day corruption met its reckoning, and the man who came for it vanished without a trace. Story 2, What They Buried to Heal Us. The reservoir's edge, each step a careful negotiation with gravity and slick stones. The water was dark and still, the surface disturbed only by small ripples where the wind skimmed across it. No footprints, no body, no sign of anyone who could have pressed a hand against the underside of the glass. Mark shone the flashlight along the cave where the foundation pillars met the water. Shadows played across the stone, but there was nothing there, nothing living, nothing tangible. When he climbed back to the house, Lily was perched on the edge of the glass floor, legs dangling, eyes wide. "Did you see it, Daddy?" she whispered, voice trembling with awe or fear. Mark nodded, keeping his voice steady, though a knot of unease had coiled tight in his chest. "Yes, honey, I saw it." But he couldn't explain it, how a handprint could appear on the underside of 3 inches of solid tempered glass. His mind raced through every logical explanation. A reflection, an optical illusion, sediment settling oddly. None fit. That night Mark stayed awake longer than usual, sitting on the living room couch with the soft hum of the HVAC filling the silence. The house was otherwise quiet, too quiet. The glass floor above the reservoir reflected the faint moonlight, turning the water beneath into an abyssal mirror. Mark's thoughts drifted to the improvements in Lily's breathing, the inexplicable disappearance of her inhaler from her belt, the strange, clean scent of limestone clinging to her skin. Each detail individually could be written off. Together, they felt like a pattern, a rhythm, a pulse he couldn't yet identify. Over the next week, small anomalies continued. Objects subtly shifted, doors left ajar, the occasional sound of water trickling when no faucet ran. Lily's health continued to improve at an impossible rate, each measurement and peak flow test defying reason. She laughed more, her voice ringing clear and effortless, as if the house itself breathed in time with her. Mark couldn't shake the handprint. Each morning he returned to the glass floor, shining his flashlight below, scanning for movement. Always the same emptiness. Yet somehow he knew it had been real. Someone or something had been there, and it had left a message he couldn't yet read. Then one evening, as the sun dipped low and the water beneath the house took on the color of molten gold, Lily ran across the glass floor, giggling, and stopped abruptly. "Daddy," she said, eyes fixed on the surface. "Look," Mark froze. On the upper side of the glass, faint but undeniable, another handprint had formed. This one faced downward, the fingers curling slightly as if gripping the floor from above, pressed in the same gray-brown sediment as before. Mark's heart pounded. He knelt beside her, tracing the outline with his fingertips, feeling the impossibility of it. Tempered glass didn't allow for impressions like this. Not from the top, not from the bottom. The sediment had appeared overnight. There had been no wind, no rain, no movement that could account for it. Lily leaned close. "They're talking to me," she said softly. Mark's stomach tightened. "Who, honey?" "They're happy," she whispered. "The water is happy, it likes me." Mark looked at the abyss beneath the glass floor, then at the shimmering surface of the reservoir, black and endless. For the first time he felt the depth of the house, not just its floors, its beams, its walls, but the way it lived, watched, responded. The handprints were a language, and Lily was the only one fluent enough to hear it. That night Mark lay awake on the bedroom floor, listening to the subtle rhythm of the house. A drip here, a breath of wind there, the quiet susurration of water beneath the glass. And he realized with both dread and awe that moving here wasn't just a fresh start. It was the beginning of something far older, far stranger, and far more alive than he could have ever imagined. Mark stood at the edge of the reservoir, staring up at the house that seemed to hang impossibly over the water. 40 feet above, the cantilevered glass floor jutted outward like a suspended jaw, daring anyone to trust it. From this angle, the glass was solid, reflective, betraying nothing of the world below. The water lapped quietly against the cliff base, dark, still, and impossibly deep. No boat, no ladder, no trace of human presence. And yet there it was, the handprint pressed firmly on the interior side of the glass, impossibly clean, impossibly deliberate. Back inside, Mark snapped photos from every angle, trying to capture what his eyes refused to rationalize. He rifled through the sparse paperwork left by Dalton Webb, the previous owner. Almost nothing remained. No phone number, no forwarding address, just a defunct P.O. box. County records placed the house in 1967, part of the massive reservoir project that had swallowed hundreds of acres of farmland, a testament to human ambition. Meanwhile, Lily lay on her stomach on the glass floor, mesmerized. 3 glasses of water sat beside her like offerings, each one drained in turn as she watched the dark depths below. Mark sat nearby, laptop open, attempting to focus on a looming project, but his attention kept snapping back to her. Hour after hour, she didn't twitch, didn't wheeze, didn't flinch, not the usual warning signs of an asthma attack. Her breathing was unnervingly calm, unnervingly perfect. By nightfall, she had consumed more water than seemed humanly safe. Mark's thoughts spiraled toward hyponatremia, the risk of seizures from overhydration, but she appeared unscathed. She picked at dinner absent-mindedly, returning to the glass floor, 2 more glasses in hand. And then he noticed it, her skin. Gone was the familiar texture of childlike roughness at elbows and knees. Instead, it gleamed, smooth and taut like wet stone or polished slate. When he grasped her hand to lead her upstairs, his fingers slid against hers unnaturally, a sensation that whispered of scales or something aquatic, yet no scales existed. Just that uncanny, liquid-like smoothness. The house itself seemed to respond after dark. The dripping sound returned. But no pipe or faucet could explain it. It came from the walls, soft and deliberate, as if the house were breathing. Mark followed it to Lily's room and found her upright in bed, eyes wide, tracking some invisible movement across the ceiling. He perched on the edge of her mattress, reaching for her hand. It was cooler than it should have been. Not merely cold, but impossibly smooth, like her skin had forgotten the boundaries of human touch. Mark's heart thudded. Every rational explanation unraveled before him. The handprints, the water, the texture of her skin. It was as if the house and the reservoir beneath it had awakened, choosing Lily as its witness, its messenger. And as he looked at her, transfixed and impossibly still, Mark realized that the life they had tried to rebuild here was not theirs alone. It belonged somehow to the house, to the water, to something older and far stranger than he could ever name. And in that moment, standing above the abyss, listening to the house whisper through walls and pipes, he knew they had stepped into a story far beyond comprehension. A story that had been waiting for someone like Lily, and for him to follow. Mark froze, staring at his daughter. Her skin glistened unnaturally, not with sweat, not with dew, but as if every cell had absorbed moisture from somewhere deeper, somewhere unseen. Lily's small hand shot toward the corner of the room, trembling slightly as she pointed where ceiling and wall met. "The water, it has friends," she said, her voice calm, almost detached. "The air, it's lonely." The words should have sounded like a child's imagination, yet they carried a weight that pressed against his chest. Mark's spine stiffened. He forced himself to look where she indicated. Only shadows lingered there, dense and oddly layered, darker than mere absence of light should allow. Lily rolled onto her side, her back to him, and within moments her breathing had slowed into deep, steady sleep. Mark remained frozen in the corner, watching, listening. The shadows seemed to pull inward as if something lay beneath their surface. From the walls came a rhythmic drip, patient and deliberate, echoing like a hidden pulse. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed distorted in that room. The next day, Mark dug into the history of the house. At the county office, he traced deeds and permits, unraveling layers of construction and abandonment. The reservoir, completed in 1965, had swallowed the Marchbank Ranch, leaving jagged cliffs and raw shoreline. The house had risen 2 years later, perched precariously on one of the few natural formations above the waterline. No record existed for the glass floor that spanned the cantilevered living room. It had likely been added illegally, yet survived inspection in 1998 through a bureaucratic loophole. Ownership changed hands 3 times before Mark. The Stranahans built it and lived for 15 years. The Kovach family stayed barely 18 months before vanishing to Oregon, and Dalton Webb acquired it in 2003, only to leave in 2022, abandoning furniture, dishes, and a forwarding address that no longer existed. Back at the house, Mark explored more thoroughly. Behind the water heater in a dim utility closet, he discovered what he had missed before: a measuring tape mounted along the wall, meticulously marked with dates and numbers. Starting in 2019, ending abruptly in January 2022, the increments charted the growth of a child. But these weren't just height markers. Interspersed with the vertical measurements were strange numbers: lung capacity readings, peak flow measurements, meticulously rising, steadily climbing beyond what should have been physically possible for a child of her age. The final entry, dated January 15, 2022, read 450, a number that made Mark's stomach knot. Impossible, unreal, yet undeniable. His daughter had not only survived this house, she had changed within it. And as he traced the tape with his finger, a chill crawled along his spine. This house had kept secrets, nurtured something extraordinary, and now the question loomed: what had it done to Lily, and what would it demand of them next? Mark's hands trembled as he stared at the chart, tracing the numbers over and over. The final reading, 450, was twice what a child her size could ever produce. Below it, in a different, shakier hand, someone had scribbled a note. She asked to go swimming in January. 40-degree water felt warm. And beneath that, a line in pencil that sent a chill through him: don't fight it, let her go. The weight of it pressed down on him. Dalton Webb had watched this transformation unfold for 3 years, quietly recording it, feeding the process, observing as it grew. At first, the changes had been subtle, almost imperceptible. But in 2019, something had accelerated. Webb had discovered something in the reservoir, something alive, something that reshaped a child's body and lungs. He had tried to control it, measured it meticulously, then realized the magnitude of what he had unleashed. When Lily had asked to swim in freezing water, he understood fully what she was becoming, and he had run. Mark continued digging. In the back of the hall closet, hidden behind winter coats, he found a single small rain boot. Bright yellow, child-sized, meant for puddle jumping. The rubber inside was damp, though it had been sitting untouched for at least 2 years. When he lifted it, water poured out, cold, mineral-heavy, unnervingly abundant. More than a boot that size could ever contain. It spilled over his hands onto the floor, and Mark stumbled back. This house, this reservoir, this water, it was a conduit. Webb had lived it, measured it, recorded it, and then left behind a warning in 6 quiet words. The house hadn't chosen Mark by chance. It had waited patiently, like a predator circling, until someone arrived with a child who struggled to breathe. And the past whispered its grim tale. In a faded microfiche column from August 1979, a boy named Timothy Branch, 7 years old, had vanished near the reservoir's north shore. Found 4 days later, caught in submerged brush, his death ruled accidental. The family had moved away within a month. Digging deeper, Mark learned the Branch family had once owned land along the reservoir, lost to eminent domain, and fought bitterly in court before surrendering. Mark's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he drove back toward the house, every rational explanation fraying at the edges. Something deep in this place reshaped children, something invisible and patient, waiting for those it deemed vulnerable. He could feel it now, a quiet pulse beneath the walls, a hunger mirrored in the water and the shadows. And he knew with an icy certainty that whatever had been done to Timothy Branch, whatever had shaped Dalton Webb's daughter, was waiting for Lily. Mark was still trying to convince himself there had to be a logical reason, some neurological explanation, some buried trauma, when he found Lily in the bathroom. The tub was roaring, water blasting from the faucet. It had been filled almost to the rim. Lily lay beneath the surface, completely submerged, eyes open, staring upward through the rippling distortion. Not thrashing, not panicking, just resting. Time fractured. Mark ripped the drain plug free and dragged her out by her shoulders, water sloshing onto the tile. She surfaced with a sharp breath, but not a cough. No sputtering, no choking. Just confusion, like he yanked her away from something important. Her hair weighed too much in his hands. Not soaked heavy, but dense, as if each strand had learned to hold mass. He wrapped her in towels, rubbed until his arms ached. The towels became saturated instantly, but her hair never dried. It stayed slick, perpetually damp, like it belonged somewhere else. She couldn't explain why she'd been under the water, didn't remember filling the tub, didn't understand why he looked afraid. She padded into the kitchen afterward and drank glass after glass of tap water in silence. 4, then a 5th. Mark watched, throat tight, knowing the emergency room would find nothing. Her breathing was perfect. Her color was good. Medicine had no vocabulary for what was happening to his daughter. That night, he didn't close his eyes. He sat in the hallway, positioned between her bedroom and the stairs. The dripping sound was gone, replaced by something worse. An internal movement, wet and slow, as if something large were shifting through the walls, using the house as a body. At exactly 2:00 a.m., Lily stepped into the hallway. She didn't look at him. She walked past with calm certainty, feet whispering against the floor. Mark followed, heart pounding so hard it hurt, down the stairs, toward the glass. She stopped at the edge of the transparent floor, the black reservoir yawning beneath. Then she stepped onto it, centered herself, directly above the handprint. She raised her palm and pressed it flat against the glass. Beneath it, another shape formed on the underside, smaller, perfectly aligned, child-sized. Not dirt this time, not sediment. Something luminous and wet, like condensation learning how to become fingers. Lily smiled. The expression didn't belong on her face. It was too wide, too deliberate, held a fraction too long. Mark lunged, grabbing her arm. Her skin was cold. Not chilled cold like stone pulled from deep water. She turned to him, eyes bright, peaceful, and terribly sure. "He says I don't need air anymore," she said softly. "He says the water remembers us." Below them something moved. Not a ripple, not a current. A response. Mark wrapped his arms around her shoulders and yanked her back from the glass. She didn't fight him. She didn't even acknowledge him. Her eyes stayed locked on the darkness below, as if something down there was still speaking. He carried her upstairs. Her weight felt wrong, too evenly distributed, like carrying a sack of wet sand. He put her in her bedroom, shut the door, and locked it. She didn't cry. She didn't knock. She didn't call his name. When Mark pressed his ear to the door, there was nothing. No breathing, no shifting sheets. Just a silence so complete it pressed back against him, heavy and wrong. He went back downstairs. The second handprint was already dissolving. Whatever had shaped it was losing definition, beads of moisture sliding away until the glass was clean again. Only the original print remained, dark and crusted. Mark placed his own hand over it. Too small for an adult, a child's hand, 8, maybe 9. Timothy Branch had been 7. The realization sat in his chest like ice. At dawn, Mark started dialing numbers from the phone directory. 3 listings. He called all of them. The first 2 had never heard the name. The third went quiet the moment he said it. "How did you get this number?" the woman asked. Mark explained everything. The house, the reservoir, the article, the handprint. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked one question. "Is there a child living in that house?" "Yes," Mark said. Her voice hardened. "You need to leave today. Don't pack, just go." The line went dead. He called back again and again, no answer. Using an address search, he drove across town to a modest ranch house on the east side. The woman who opened the door held her phone like a weapon, ready to dial. She was older, her face carved by years that hadn't been gentle. When Mark showed her the photo of the handprint, something in her expression gave way. She led him inside. She brought out a shoebox filled with old papers, newspaper clippings, letters, photographs yellowed at the edges. Timothy Branch had been her nephew. His family had owned the land before it became the reservoir. They fought the takeover for years. Lost. The water came anyway. 6 months later, Timothy drowned. She spread photos across the table. A thin boy, serious eyes, standing near heavy machinery as the land was torn apart, watching. His parents never recovered. His father drank himself into the ground. His mother disappeared from the family forever. Mark asked where Timothy's body had been found. "Not there," she said, shaking her head, "but that's where they looked first." She told him about the house that had once stood below the cliff, the old ranch home. The county never demolished it. Too expensive. They just let the water rise over it. It was still there. 40 feet down. Preserved. Timothy had been obsessed with it. Asked if the people inside were still trapped when the water came. Mark felt his hands go numb. The glass floor wasn't hovering over empty water. It hovered over a submerged house. The handprint wasn't reaching up toward Mark's living room. It was reaching outward, from a window or doorway below, pressed against what had once been glass. Mark drove back like a man fleeing a fire. He ran red lights, ignored horns. Lily's bedroom door was open. She wasn't there. He found her in the kitchen, drinking straight from the faucet. Water spilled down her chin, soaked her shirt, pooled across the floor. She shut off the tap slowly and looked at him. Her eyes were wrong, the whites dulled to gray. The pupils expanded until almost nothing else remained. She looked at him like he didn't belong there. Mark filled a glass and drank. The water tasted ordinary, treated, safe. But Lily had drunk gallons of it, and it had rewritten her. He finally understood why. His lungs had never failed him, never begged for relief, never needed an alternative. Lily's body had been fighting the air since the day she was born. And when the water offered her a way to stop fighting, more like something that had been cured in brine. Her fingers tightened just enough to make the message clear. Not pain, not a threat, an invitation. "Daddy," she said softly, and for the first time since this had begun, her voice sounded like her again. Small, tired. "It's so quiet down there." Mark closed the truck door before he could answer. He drove without turning on the radio, without looking at the reservoir as it slid past the road like a sheet of black glass. Lily sat still the entire drive, water beating slowly at her hairline, soaking into the collar of her sweatshirt no matter how many times he wiped it away. At the hospital, the automatic doors hissed open and shut behind them. Fluorescent lights, dry air, the smell of disinfectant so sharp it almost burned. Lily shivered violently now, her body remembering, too late, how cold it was supposed to feel when it wasn't submerged. A nurse took her vitals, frowned at the oxygen saturation, then frowned harder when it climbed instead of dropped as Lily held her breath. They admitted her for observation. By noon, she was breathing normally. By evening, her lungs sounded clearer than they had in years. No wheeze, no rattle, no strain. The pulmonologist called it remarkable, used the word unprecedented twice, asked careful questions about water exposure, about aspiration, about near-drowning events. Mark answered as little as he could. That night, Lily slept. Real sleep. Dry sheets. No sound but the slow, steady rhythm of air moving in and out of her chest the way it never had before. At 2:17 a.m., Mark woke up because the room felt wrong. Not silent, hospitals are never silent, but hollow, like sound had lost its direction. Lily was sitting upright in bed, eyes open, staring at the window. Moonlight spilled across the linoleum, and for a moment Mark thought he saw condensation on the glass as if it were underwater. Then she blinked, and it was gone. They discharged her 2 days later. Mark never went back to the house. He sold it to the county for less than half of what he'd paid, citing structural concerns. They didn't argue. Within a month, fencing went up along the cliff. Opaque barriers, warning signs, no trespassing, no mention of what lay beneath. At night sometimes, Mark still dreams of the submerged house. In the dream, the window is closed again. The handprint is gone. The water is dark and still, holding its secrets the way it always has. But Lily's dreams are different. She dreams of pressure that doesn't hurt, of darkness that feels like rest, of a place where breathing is effortless, where the water carries you instead of fighting you. Sometimes she wakes up smiling. Sometimes, when Mark passes her room late at night, he hears nothing at all from the other side of the door. Not breathing, not movement, just a silence so complete it feels heavy. She'd been primed for it. Mark closed the panel and staggered back, retching onto the concrete floor. The image wouldn't leave him. Timothy suspended in the tank like a specimen, a grotesque organ in a system that had never been meant to hold him. The dripping wasn't a leak, it was circulation. Every drop that fell was another fraction of a boy reduced into solution, another lesson carried upward through pipes and into Lily's body. He climbed out of the subbase and sealed the hatch with shaking hands. Upstairs, Lily lay in the bathtub, eyes open, watching the ceiling through the water. She didn't thrash, didn't reach for him. She was calm in a way that terrified him more than panic ever could. When he drained the tub, she coughed once, just once, then inhaled air again with visible effort. The relief on her face faded quickly, replaced by confusion, then pain. Her chest tight. The old wheeze crept back in like a memory reasserting itself. "You're killing me," she whispered again, and this time he knew she meant it literally. He wrapped her in towels and carried her to the living room, laying her on the couch. Her breathing grew shallow. Every instinct screamed at him to fill the tub again, to give her what her body now craved. He imagined years of it: bathtubs, reservoirs, pools. Lily growing stronger in water and weaker in air, drifting farther from anything human. The house groaned softly around them. Pipes ticked. Somewhere below, water moved. Mark made his choice before he let himself think too long. He called the county water authority and reported contamination. Biological, severe. He didn't explain how he knew. He didn't need to. By dawn, trucks arrived. Men in protective suits shut off the main line and drained the system. They sealed the filtration tank without opening it. No one asked what was inside. Lily screamed when the water stopped running. Her recovery was slow and brutal. Weeks in the hospital, steroids, oxygen, machines that hissed and clicked and forced air into lungs that now resisted it like a foreign substance. The doctors called it a setback, a strange one. They had no explanation for why her asthma had briefly disappeared or why it had come back worse. Mark moved them far inland. No reservoirs, no lakes, dry air, high ground. Years passed. Lily grew, learned to live with the pain again, learned to breathe the hard way, the way humans always have. She never fully forgave him. She never fully understood what he'd taken from her, only that something had been lost. Sometimes when they pass a body of water, she stops walking. She stares at the surface with an expression Mark recognizes now. Not longing, not fear, but recognition. As if something down there is still aware of her, still waiting. And far away, beneath layers of silt and cold, the submerged house remains. Its windows closed, its doors intact, empty at last. But water remembers what it has taught. She hadn't been thirsty. That was the lie Mark finally understood. Lily hadn't been drinking water out of habit or comfort or some childish fixation. She'd been obeying something older than thought. Her body had recognized a solution before her mind ever could. What had taken a dead boy years in darkness had taken Lily days in daylight. Not because she was stronger, but because the water had been inside her. Because her lungs, scarred and narrowed since birth, were desperate enough to accept a rewrite. Because air had been hurting her for as long as she could remember, and the water didn't. Mark stood in the bathroom doorway and watched his daughter rest beneath the surface of the tub. Her eyes were open, calm. A faint rise and fall moved through her chest, steady as sleep. She wasn't drowning. She was breathing. He knew then he was running out of time. Hours, maybe less. Whatever her body was becoming was nearing completion. Once finished, there would be no going back. Hospitals wouldn't understand. Doctors would force air into lungs that no longer wanted it. Machines would scream. Specialists would argue. And Lily would die while they tried to save her. He sat on the closed toilet lid and stared at the inhaler on the counter. Years of planning had revolved around that small plastic object. Vacations canceled, playdates cut short, nights spent counting breaths, and now it was meaningless. Her illness hadn't vanished. It had been solved. Rachel wasn't here. She signed the papers months ago, handed him the authority, and walked away. This wasn't a shared decision. No committee, no second opinion. Only a father and a choice no human being was meant to make. Let his daughter finish changing, or force her back into a body that was killing her. His hand moved before his mind caught up. He pulled the drain. The water spiraled away. Lily's eyes snapped wide. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her lungs were full. Mark yanked her from the tub and laid her on the tile, already counting compressions. Water poured from her mouth with every push. Too much water, far too much. It kept coming dark, cold, carrying grit that smeared gray across the floor. Flecks of algae, rot, things that belonged at the bottom of a reservoir, not inside a child. He kept going, telling himself this was rescue, telling himself this was right. The smell hit him next. Not chlorine, not clean. It was old water, still water. Water that had not moved in decades. It spread across the tiles until the bathroom looked like a drained pond bed. Then Lily went still. He checked her breathing, nothing. He forced air into her lungs again and again. Her chest rose, but wrong. The shape of it disturbed him. The resistance wasn't where it should be. Her ribs bent too easily. The air seemed to slide somewhere it didn't belong, bulging along her sides, her back, as if her lungs had rearranged themselves, multiplied, become something else entirely. Mark stopped. No pulse. Her pupils were blown wide, unresponsive. By every rule he knew, his daughter was dead. He sat there holding her, the training running through his head like an accusation. He had done everything correctly, and he had killed her by giving her what humans were supposed to need. The truth landed all at once, clean and merciless. The water hadn't been trying to take her. It had been trying to keep her alive. Air was the poison. Water was the cure. And Mark had ripped it away because he couldn't accept a future that didn't look human enough. The tub still held a thin layer of water, refusing to drain completely. Mark stared at it, at the faucet, at the pipes humming faintly behind the walls. Somewhere below, in a place never meant to be opened, the system still flowed. The connection still existed. The teacher was still there. He lifted Lily's body and placed her back into the tub. Her skin was cold, too cold. He turned both taps fully open. Water rushed in, hot and cold, blending into something gentle. He positioned her carefully, lowering her beneath the surface. Nothing happened. Then movement. A faint ripple, a shudder through her chest. Water flowed in and out of her mouth in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Color crept back into her skin. Her eyes opened. She looked at him, not confused, not afraid, clear, awake, alive in a way she had never been before. Mark collapsed beside the tub and wept, knowing exactly what he had done. He hadn't saved his daughter. He had followed her into a future where air was optional, water was home, and survival no longer belonged to the world that made sense. And somewhere deep below, something old and patient continued to teach, waiting for the next child who couldn't breathe. He pushed her head fully under and kept it there, making sure no part of her broke the surface. Then he sat on the closed toilet and did nothing. The tub kept filling. He didn't reach for the taps. He didn't flinch when water crested the porcelain rim and spilled onto the tile. It spread outward in slow, deliberate waves, seeping into grout lines, creeping toward the hallway. Somewhere inside the walls, the sound returned, no longer a drip, no longer subtle. It was active now, urgent. Pipes groaned and sighed as if whatever lived inside them knew exactly what he was allowing and was eager to finish the work. Mark watched Lily beneath the surface. Her eyes were open but vacant. Her hair drifted around her skull like dark weeds. Her skin had lost all warmth, all color. By every rule he'd ever trusted, she was gone. But those rules had already failed her once. The water climbed higher, sloshed against the tub's edge. Mark stayed still. Time stretched, collapsed, lost all shape. Then, so faint he almost convinced himself it was imagination, her fingers moved. A twitch. Her chest expanded. Not the forced rise of CPR. Not air being pushed where it didn't belong. This was different. Her ribs shifted sideways, widening her torso in a way human anatomy never allowed, creating space where there hadn't been space before. Water slid into her mouth and nose, and instead of rejecting it, her body welcomed it, drew it deeper. Her throat worked. Her eyes sharpened. They found him. Recognition flickered there, dim, distant, like someone seen through murky glass. Her lips moved. Shapes formed. Words tried to exist in a medium that wouldn't carry them. Mark plunged his hand into the tub. Her fingers wrapped around his. The grip was weak, but undeniable. Her skin felt wrong, softer, almost porous, as if water no longer sat on the surface but passed through her. The change that had taken a dead boy years in darkness was racing through her now, compressed into hours by water that carried him dissolved within it. She was becoming what he had become. Something built for the places humans abandoned, for rooms drowned and left intact, for children who sank too young and learned new rules instead of dying. Mark let go and shut off the taps. The bathroom floor was flooded. Water slid into the hall in thin sheets. He would deal with it later. For now, he sat and watched his daughter breathe water, her body moving in a rhythm no living human should have. Her eyes tracked things above her, things he couldn't see. She was alive in the only way left to her. And Mark understood the truth with brutal clarity. He had lost her once by trying to save her, and brought her back by letting go of what she used to be. The choice had never been life or death. It had been which life. When he returned, Lily was sitting upright in the tub. Water streamed from her hair. Her eyes were sharp, focused, calm. She tried to speak. Only bubbles escaped. She smiled anyway, a wide, unfamiliar smile that belonged to something no longer confined by normal limits. And Mark knew without doubt that she was happy. The tightness that had ruled every breath of her childhood was gone. No wheezing, no panic, no invisible clock counting down each inhale. She was free in a way she had never been while breathing air. He knelt beside the tub. She reached up and touched his face. Her fingers were cold, gentle. She was trying to tell him something, trying to bridge the gap between water and air, but language failed her. So instead, she tugged his hand toward the tub. An invitation. Come with me. Change 2. Mark pulled back. He couldn't. Some part of him still belonged to dry rooms and solid floors and oxygen-filled lungs. He needed air. He needed gravity to behave. But he also couldn't leave her here, caught between worlds, unable to fully belong to either. So he researched. The reservoir stretched for hundreds of acres. Beneath its surface lay more than one house, barns, sheds, a church, entire pieces of a vanished town. Depths ranged from shallow coves to crushing darkness near the dam. Timothy Branch had survived there for decades, had learned, had adapted, and now, no longer alone, he was teaching. There was room down there. Plenty of it. Space for something that breathed water to live. Mark finally understood how much space there really was down there. Not just room, but community. He made calls anyway. He told himself it was caution, that he needed certainty before doing anything irreversible. The first diver listened patiently until Mark mentioned the structure beneath the house. The glass floor, the way you could see straight down. The line went quiet. Then the diver said he knew that place. Said the last owner had asked similar questions and backed out fast. When Mark pressed him, The man muttered something about not wanting clarity where darkness had been doing a fine job. He refused the job. The second company agreed. No questions. A man would come at sunrise. That night, Lily didn't stay in the tub. She climbed out on her own, pajamas dripping, feet leaving a trail of water as she moved through the house. Mark followed her silently down the stairs. She stopped at the glass floor and stood there, gazing into the depths. Below, the window was open again. The pale figure waited inside the drowned house, hands spread against the glass, face tilted upward. Lily mirrored the gesture, palms flat, fingers aligned. Mark watched them, two children separated by decades in water and glass, communicating without words. Both had learned the same lesson. Morning came too fast. The diver introduced himself as Carl. He looked competent, relaxed, the kind of man who trusted equipment and experience. As he unloaded tanks and weights, he glanced up at the overhanging glass and laughed nervously. Said it was an engineering nightmare. Said someone was begging to get sued. Mark just told him where to go. Carl hesitated when he understood. Asked if Mark really wanted to see what was beneath his home. Mark told him the truth. It wasn't about seeing anymore. Carl entered the water. From above, Mark watched him vanish into murk, then reappear as a shadow near the submerged house. The live feed flickered on the monitor. The structure looked frozen in time, walls intact, windows clouded but whole. Carl swam closer to the window. Up close, the glass was scarred. Stress lines radiated outward, as if something had leaned against it for years. Carl reached out. The window didn't break. It opened. Violently. Water surged. The shockwave knocked Carl backward. The camera spun wildly, catching glimpses of darkness rushing forward, pale movement, something fast and intentional. Carl's breathing turned frantic, bubbling through the microphone. A scream tried to form. Then the feed cut. Mark ran. Bubbles erupted near the base of the cliff, then vanished. Seconds crawled. At 5 minutes, Mark reached for his phone. Carl surfaced far out, swimming like an animal fleeing fire. He dragged himself onto shore, tore off his mask, and clutched Mark's shirt with shaking hands. "Don't," he said, "don't ever." His body started convulsing. Mark wrapped him in a blanket, asked what he'd seen. Carl didn't answer. He fled, leaving gear behind. The camera lay cracked in shallow water. Mark retrieved it. The final frame showed the pale figure emerging through the window. Small, familiar, but behind it, deeper inside the house, more shapes waited. Children. The drowned house was full of them. And Lily was not alone anymore. The truth settled slowly, like silt sinking through still water. They weren't alone down there. Children had been disappearing into the reservoir for decades, slipping from docks, wandering too close, pulled under by accidents that were written off and forgotten. Some bodies were never found. Some were recovered too late to matter. But all of them had ended up in the same place, drawn to the structure trapped between worlds. A house that refused to decay. A doorway that never truly closed. And now Lily was part of it. Mark went back upstairs. She was in the bathtub again, fully submerged, eyes open, calmly watching him through the wavering surface. He sat on the toilet lid, mouth opening and closing as he searched for words that wouldn't exist in any language she still understood. That she couldn't stay. That there was no cure. That he had failed her. But the fear he expected wasn't there. No panic, no confusion, just stillness, contentment, as if the fight she'd been born into had finally ended. The inhalers, the breathing treatments, the endless calculations, whether pollen, dust, distance to the nearest hospital, all of it was gone, not managed, gone. He had spent years trying to help her draw breath more easily, and the only thing that had ever worked was letting her stop breathing air at all. By afternoon, Mark picked up a sledgehammer. The glass floor didn't want to leave quietly. Bolts screamed. Panels cracked but refused to shatter. When one finally gave way, the sound was sharp and violent, and suddenly his living room opened into empty air. Then water, 40 feet straight down. Lily appeared beside him, dripping wet, puddles forming where she stood. She looked through the hole, eyes focused, curious, ready. He knelt and told her why he was doing this, why she couldn't live in a bathtub, why the world above would never make space for what she'd become. The only place she could survive was below, with the others who had learned the same lesson too late. She didn't cry. She smiled. Her hand found his, cold, slick, barely human anymore, and squeezed. Mark carried her to the opening. Sunlight glittered off the reservoir below, beautiful and uncaring. The submerged house was clearly visible now. The window stood open. Shapes moved inside, waiting. He held her over the edge. She spread her arms. When he let go, she didn't scream. She fell cleanly, calmly, arms wide as if the air itself had betrayed her one last time. She struck the water and vanished. Then she surfaced. Not gasping, not thrashing. Breathing. Her chest rose and fell as naturally as it ever had. She dove again, deeper, stronger, her movements fluid and sure. She reached the house, slipped through the open window, and disappeared into the waiting pale shapes. For a moment Mark saw them clearly, children, or what remained of them, closing in around her, welcoming her. Then the window shut. The house went still. Mark sat alone beside the hole in his floor, staring into depths that no longer moved. His daughter was gone from his world, not dead, but unreachable, alive in a place where he could never follow. He thought about jumping, about letting the water take him too, but the change hadn't been instant for Lily. It had taken time. He would only drown. So he stayed. The next week blurred into questions and searches, police, divers, reports. The reservoir gave them nothing. Equipment failed. Visibility dropped. No one went near the house twice. Eventually, the searches stopped. Mark sealed the hole. He sold the house. He moved away. Sometimes at night, he dreams of water filling his lungs and waking without pain. And sometimes, just before he wakes, he swears he hears movement far below the surface. Children breathing. Everyone agreed it was an accident. After 3 days of dragging hooks through black water and finding nothing, the officials closed their notebooks and wrote my daughter into the category reserved for losses too deep to retrieve. Lily became a word on paper, presumed, gone. Her mother arrived the next morning. She stood where the living room used to make sense, stared into the jagged opening in the floor, and asked me what I'd done. I didn't soften it. I didn't hide behind confusion or grief. I told her about the marks on the glass, about the thing in the tank, about the moment my hands opened and my child fell. She listened without blinking. When I finished, she struck me so hard I tasted blood. Then she left. Legally, Lily had been mine. Legally, losing her was my failure. The house didn't last much longer. Inspectors condemned it, citing sins buried so far in paperwork they might as well have been fossils. They ordered it erased. I didn't argue. I stayed until the deadline, alone, sitting beside the hole, watching the water below as if patience might summon her back. The nights were worse. Moist sounds crept through the walls again, not just dripping but sliding as if something was learning the layout, tracing pipes and corners, searching rooms that no longer belonged to a child. I kept the bathtub running, a quiet invitation. It stayed empty. I drank from the tap constantly, swallowing glass after glass, hoping the water still carried whatever had rewritten Lily. My body refused. My lungs burned for air like they always had. Nothing changed. I was already finished being adaptable. When the demolition crew came, I watched from my truck. They broke the glass first. Shards fell and vanished. Then they cut the supports. The house screamed as it gave up. Wood, metal, and memories slid into the reservoir, swallowed without ceremony. The surface settled. It was as if none of it had ever existed. I waited for something, movement, a pale shape, her face rising through the depth. The water stayed silent. I sold what was left for almost nothing. Someone planned to build something expensive and clean there, something that didn't acknowledge what lay beneath. I took the check and left. Austin gave me an apartment and work and people who didn't ask questions. I pretended to function. At night, I dreamed of dark rooms underwater, of children moving with ease where they shouldn't survive, of lungs that didn't need air. A year passed. I went back. The cliff was bare stone now. No house, no scar except the water itself. I brought cheap gear, nothing safe, nothing smart. I didn't want safety, I wanted certainty. The water was colder than memory. I swam out and dove. Pressure clawed at my ears. My chest tightened almost immediately. 15 feet down, pain, 20 panic. Below me through the murk the house waited, still there, still whole. I forced myself lower. My vision tunneled. Every instinct screamed upward. Then the window moved. A small face pressed against the glass from inside. Blurred, altered, unmistakable. Recognition doesn't need clarity. Lily looked at me from a world I had given her and could never enter. My body failed. I fled upward, lungs on fire, breaking the surface in a violent gasp. I crawled onto the shore and coughed until my ribs shook. When I finally looked back, the water was calm again. She was still there, alive, breathing where I could not. And I understood then that I hadn't lost her to death. I'd lost her to survival, just not the kind meant for me. He stared at the water one last time before leaving. It looked harmless, flat, quiet, empty. And yet far beneath that calm skin, his daughter was still living inside a decision he'd made without ever understanding its cost. She survived because she no longer needed air. Cold and darkness preserved her, the same way they preserved everything else the reservoir claimed. Time would barely touch her. Years might pass, maybe longer. Mark drove back to the city and never returned. There was nothing left for him there. No rescue, no reversal. Even if it were possible, undoing what had happened would only finish the job. She belonged to the depths now, to the flooded rooms, to the others like her, children who had slipped beneath the surface and learned how not to disappear. 2 years later, a headline caught his eye. A boy vanished while swimming. Search crews worked the water for days. Nothing surfaced. The word drowned was used with confidence. The parents stood in front of cameras holding a smiling photo, asking for answers they would never be given. Mark thought about calling them, about telling them the truth, about explaining that their son hadn't vanished, he'd changed, that he was still breathing, still moving, just not in a way they could reach. He didn't make the call. No one wants that kind of truth. It's kinder to imagine stillness at the bottom than endurance in a place you can never follow. He kept what proof he had: photos, articles, diagrams, evidence of a world that shouldn't exist and did anyway. Late at night, when the weight grew unbearable, he filled the tub and held his head under, trying to picture how it felt to live without air. His body rebelled every time: burning lungs, locked throat, violent need. He always came back up choking. Her cure, he told himself. That was the word he used when the guilt sharpened. She had spent her childhood fighting for breath, surrounded by warnings and machines and fear. Now she breathed something that didn't betray her, something that sustained her. Maybe letting go was the only way he'd ever helped her. Or maybe it was the worst thing he'd ever done. He couldn't decide. The old definitions didn't apply anymore. Life, death, those words meant nothing in places where children learned to exist outside the rules. So he kept going. Work, meals, sleep. Days stacked on top of each other out of habit more than hope. At night the dreams returned. Water, depth, the house waiting below, pale faces at the glass. In the dreams the window opened. The water welcomed him. His lungs adapted instantly. He reached her. He stayed. Then morning came. He woke alone, air burning his chest, the memory of water lingering like a phantom ache. She was still down there. He was still up here. The distance between them measured not just in depth, but in biology, in impossibility. Sometimes he drove past the reservoir without slowing. Just another stretch of road, just water. Once he saw children playing along the shore, laughing, parents watching with casual trust. He didn't stop. What would he tell them? The surface showed nothing. The depths held everything. The real horror wasn't loss. It wasn't transformation. It was permanence. She was alive. She would remain alive. And he would spend the rest of his life knowing that somewhere beneath still water, his daughter was breathing in a way he never could, while he carried the knowledge of that survival like a sentence he could never serve and never escape. Bright plastic floated on the surface. Neon rings, inflatable animals. Parents lounged on folding chairs, skin shining with sunscreen, thermoses sweating in the heat. Children shrieked as they kicked through the shallows, their feet churning water that hid everything beneath it. 40 feet down, something else watched. Mark kept driving, but his eyes stayed on them too long. He wondered which of those kids would swallow a mouthful, which tap, miles away, would carry a trace of what had dissolved into the system years ago. He wondered if the water was still capable of choosing someone, of teaching another body how to survive where it shouldn't. He wanted to believe it couldn't happen again. But belief had betrayed him before. Belief was why he pulled Lily out of the tub. Belief was why he forced air into lungs that had already started learning a different rule. Belief told him that saving a child meant keeping her human. Belief was the mistake that broke reality open and left both of them stranded on opposite sides of it. He stopped trusting hope after that. Hope was just fear wearing a comforting mask. The road curved and the reservoir slipped out of view, shrinking into a strip of silver in his mirror before vanishing entirely. Somewhere beneath that surface, in a house that had been underwater longer than Lily had been alive, she continued, not struggling, not drowning, existing. He could never reach her, could never fix it, could never unmake the choice that changed her. All he could do was keep inhaling air his lungs still demanded, and remember what it felt like to hold a child who belonged to his world, warm, fragile, dependent on breath. That memory was all that remained. And the certainty that his daughter was still down there, 40 feet below the sunlight, breathing water in a darkness that would keep her exactly as she was, long after everything above the surface had learned how to forget.